Backing up an entire database is easy, but what if we only want part of that database? Welcome to this video on backing up SQL Server. My name is Kevin Fiesel, and I'm the proprietor of Catalyxy Services LLC, a consulting firm which specializes in work all across the data platform space, especially SQL Server. We are nearing the end of this series on backup and restoration in SQL Server, and today I want to cover a slightly more advanced topic: backup and restoration of file groups in SQL Server. A file group is a logical grouping of multiple SQL Server files. There's always going to be a primary file group, which hosts, at a minimum, your system tables. You can also add user tables to this file group. Then you can have 0 or more user-defined file groups. These file groups can hold any user-defined data, including tables and non-clustered indexes. Let's go straight to a demo and see how we can take advantage of file groups as part of our business continuity strategy. Here we are in SQL Server Management Studio. I have one database on here that uses file groups, and that is Wide World Importers. Wide World Importers is a demo database that Microsoft provides. If I right-click on the database and navigate to Properties, there is a File Groups page. Let's select that. On here, we have a primary file group and a user data file group. We also have a memory-optimized file group for use with SQL Server in-memory OLTP. Let's cancel out of this so that I can take a backup. Wide World Importers is in the simple recovery model, so there will be some simplification of the process here, as well as one limitation to what we can do. Let's start the process by taking a full backup. That way, if anything goes catastrophically wrong, I can still revert to that full backup. Next, I'm going to add a file group that I will turn into a read-only file group. One of the big benefits of file group backup is that you can handle read-write and read-only file groups separately, and bring your database back online with read-write file groups while trickling in that read-only data. But because Wide World Importers doesn't have a read-only file group, we will need to create one. I will call this file group Other Data, and we'll add one file to the file group. Once that is in place, we'll need to load some data into the file group. Now that this is in place, let's move on to the last step in this chain, and that is making the file group read-only. We now have a read-only file group, as well as two normal read-write file groups and one memory-optimized file group. At this point, it's time to take some file group backups. Let me start by running a command that I know will result in an error. I am going to take a backup of a single read-write file group, the primary file group. Incidentally, because I have memory-optimized data, I also need to include that in the primary file group backup, or I will get a different error message. As we can see here, running this command shows an error message of message 3004, telling us that we cannot back up single read-write file groups in the simple recovery model when there are other read-write file groups that we did not include in the mix. The reason for this is we do not have the transaction log backups necessary to ensure that each file group is in a consistent state. And the error message was helpful enough to tell us how to fix it, and that is specify read-write file groups instead. Now this will take a moment as we are backing up almost the entire database here. In this exact scenario, file group backups aren't going to give you very much, though the idea is that your read-only file groups will likely have a lot of data in them. Data that your users aren't constantly accessing, and so you can get back up to speed faster in the event of a recovery scenario. Now let's back up the other data file group separate from the read-write file groups. Great, we now have two separate file group backups. I can read the headers for each and get an idea of what we've captured. If I drag each bar over such that first LSN is the initial column, we can see a couple of things. First, the first LSN matches both backups. So does the database backup LSN. But the last LSN and checkpoint LSN values, they do not match. The other data file group is larger than the read-write file groups in terms of LSNs. This is despite the fact that we haven't altered any data since taking the read-write file group backup. Our other data file group is read-only, so we can't change it. But this shows that the act of taking a backup does force a checkpoint operation. Now let's restore our database. I'm going to restore to a new database, Wide World Importers 3. The restore operation here is a bit chunkier than what we're used to, so let me explain it. First, we are restoring specific files, as we need to indicate which files are in the file group backup. We have the primary file, the in-memory data file, and the user data file. All of these are on disk at wideworldimporters.rw.back, and our database backup is the first backup inside of that file. From there, we will move the physical locations of the MDF, LDF, NDF, and memory optimized files. If I do not do this, I will get an error because it will try to use the same file locations as the original Wide World Importers database, and that still exists. The last bit is critical: partial and recovery. Recovery will make our database available for users. Meanwhile, the partial flag tells SQL Server that there can be other file groups that are missing, and simply to ignore that for now. We have a partial restoration, so let's test what we can do. I am going to try a couple of queries. First, let's look at the countries table and see if it exists. And yes, it does, and it returns data just as we would expect. But when we try to query the important data table, we get an ugly error with message 8653, telling us that the table resides in an offline file group. You might ask yourself, what tables can I reasonably access in this scenario? Well, that's a good question, dear viewer, because I happen to have a query for you. This comes courtesy of a Jason Straight article on SQL Server Central, and it tells you to which file group a particular table and index belong. I have to specify table and index because you are able to host different indexes in different file groups, so it's not enough to ask for just the tables. As I scroll through this list, we can see that almost every table and index is in user data, and only our important data table is in the other data. That means only queries that hit the important data table would get this error. One thing that I do want to make note of is that this query does not return memory optimized tables and indexes, so you will not see that in here. That'll be important a little bit later on. But we can also check on the status of each file group using a different query. This query looks for file groups and then loads data from database files to check the state of the file. We can see that primary, user data, and memory optimized data files are online, and the other data file state is recovery pending. Let's rectify that now. Here, we are restoring the file group with recovery. Just like before, I need to specify the files we are restoring, where we're going to move the files to, and that we are in recovery. We do not need to specify partial, and if you do try to specify partial, it will give you an error message. The reason is that the partial flag only works when you are restoring the primary file group, not for any others. This was a tiny backup, so we're already done. That means we can try those queries again. Excellent. Now we get data back for both queries. And that was file group restoration, at least using the simple recovery model. But before we get out of here, let me walk you through the full recovery model, as there are a couple of traps you can easily fall into. My first step is to restore the Wide World Importers database from my original database backup. This will take a moment, but I do want to start it over from scratch. Once it completes, we'll switch to use the full recovery model. From there, I'll take an initial full database backup. I will also take an initial transaction log backup once the full backup completes. Both of these will take a short amount of time, as the transaction log backup is actually almost 1 gigabyte in size. Now let's power through the alterations that we made in the simple recovery model scenario. These are all going to complete very quickly, so pretty soon we're good to go. The next step is I would like to take my 2 file group backups again. As you can see, I am taking a read-write backup and the other data file group as a separate file group backup. You can take individual file group backups in the full recovery model, but hold off on that thought for just a moment. Now we'll drop the Wide World Importers 3 database, just to make sure that we start off on even footing. Let's restore to wide world importers 3 just like we did before in the simple recovery model. And just to make sure that things work the same way as before, I will check my 2 canary tables. The countries table still works the way we would expect, and we get the error message that we expect from important data. And we can complete the process by loading the other data file group. To this point, everything has looked the same here between the simple and full recovery models. But there is an additional level of sophistication you can introduce with the full recovery model, and that is piecemeal read-write file group restoration. Let me show you a bit of this. I will first drop the Wide World Importers 3 database, as I'm not going to need it anymore. Next, let's take a backup of each file group individually, starting with primary and its associated memory-optimized file group. Once I have that in place, I can back up the user data file group separately. And that just leaves the other data file group. The last thing that I will do is take a tail log backup and leave the Wide World Importers database in a no recovery mode. This allows me to restore a database over Wide World Importers without replacing it. I'll restore the primary file group in partial recovery mode, just as we've done repeatedly to this point. Now this has worked fine, and it did restore the 2 file groups, the primary file group and the memory optimized file group. Now let's pick it up with user data. Running this command, we get a scary looking error message, made all the scarier if you're struggling to get a file group backup restored and you're under time pressure. This error 3116 says that the supplied backup is not on the same recovery path as the database, and so we cannot use it for online file restoration. So let's see the right way to solve this problem. Before I continue, dear viewer, this is where I'm going to admit the limits of my ignorance. My understanding of the error, based on the research I've done and the test I've performed, is that as soon as we bring our full recovery model Wide World Importers database back online, it has branched off from the version we had when we took the file group backups, and the database is now something different than what we backed up before. Therefore, the old database and log backups will not work, as we're on a new LSN trajectory. If I got any of that wrong, please feel free to correct me in the comments. Now, assuming that we're somewhere on the right track, we have 2 possible fixes. You saw the first one, where we restored all of the read-write file groups as a single cohesive action. But there is a second approach as well. First, I'll drop the database again, just to show, hey, there's nothing up my sleeves. Next, I will restore the primary and memory optimized file groups. Just as before, I am using the partial flag, but note that we are in no recovery mode. Running this will take a few moments to complete, and when we're done, we will have a Wide World Importers database that we cannot yet access. The next step is to restore our tail log backup. This thing will take several seconds to restore, but it will leave the database in a recovered state. Testing this is a little bit more of a challenge, considering we don't have any tables in the primary file group. But, like I alluded to before, we do have some memory optimized tables that we can query. I will check out the vehicle temperatures table, which is one of the 2 memory optimized tables in this database. We can see that there are in fact results for this table. Meanwhile, if I query the countries table or the important data table, I get the same error message that these file groups are offline. Let's next restore the user data file group. Because we restored the tail log backup before trying to restore this file group, we are on the same LSN path and SQL Server is happy. If you switch the order, that is, if you try to restore a non-primary file group before restoring the tail log backup, you will get an error message here. But wait, even with this restoration, we have a message in the output. It states that the roll forward start point is now at some log sequence number, but we need an additional roll forward to complete the restore sequence. At this point, user data is not actually online yet, and we can see that if we query the countries table. What we need to do is apply the tail log backup again. Now, if I rerun the query on the countries table, I get data. And we can wrap things up by restoring the other data file group. Notice that when I run this one, we don't get that message. So the other data file group is up and running, meaning that we have successfully restored wide world importers from file groups. That demo covered a lot of content, I know. And peeking behind the curtains just a little bit, it was a real slog to get the right ordering of commands for piecemeal restoration of file groups in the full recovery model. As you can imagine, however, the process is worth it when you have tight timelines for database recovery, especially for something like a data warehouse where you might have quite a few file groups covering data across different years. This allows you to bring the most recent data back online first, while restoring the older data after the crisis has ended and you have some downtime. Just make sure that you've tested the process thoroughly before that day and that you have the scripts in place beforehand so that you don't get the order of operations wrong and end up banging your head against a wall for days like I did. The next video will wrap up this series, and in it, I will share one toolset that makes backup and recovery so much easier. We'll have links and show notes in the description below, and until we see each other in the next video, take care.